Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Leiderman. To quote the words of Israel's Prime Minister, Yitzhak Shamir, "We have plenty of friends," as he put it, in the world who would like to see us dead, wounded, trampled, suppressed. And then it will be possible to pity the wretched Jew, to commiserate with him. Lately, however, the scenario is hardly the one being played out in Israel. The government has taken a very tough line with the civil disturbances, the rioting, the unrest that has taken place among the Arabs on the West Bank and in Gaza. Israel's enemies, predictably, are outraged. However, the policies of the government have created a great deal of consternation among her political allies, as well as private citizens, especially the American Jewish community. We thought we'd discuss various attitudes of what is going on in Israel today, talk about what is being reported, what might not be reported, and to get some views from some prominent people here in Chicago. First of all, I'd like to introduce Professor Jeffry Mallow. Professor Mallow is with Loyola University. He is also Vice President of the Labor Alliance of Chicago. Welcome, Professor Mallow. Good to have you with us again. Richard Wexler. Mr. Wexler is the immediate past president of the Jewish Federation of Metropolitan Chicago. He is also the chairman of the Jewish Community Relations Council, the JCRC, and good to have you with us again. And finally, Ambassador Tzvi Brosh, Consul General for Chicago and the Midwestern states. Mr. Ambassador, again, good to have you with us. Let me start with you. This is such a complex issue at this point, but what we Americans are hearing, a lot of American Jews are hearing, is that Israel is being compared to no longer David, but Goliath. That the Palestinian population, which has been under occupation for 20 years, is being suppressed, repressed, and in more than 36 cases to this date, shot and killed. This is not the Israel that people have been led to believe. What can you say in this regard as to what the government is doing?
First of all, our primary concern is not what kind of Israel you see, but to ensure that it is an Israel that will live. The problem we have right now, which is crucial to the existence of the state, very, very complex, is to deal at a stage when we thought we were getting closer to a negotiation and to peace with our neighbors, to deal with violence on a scale that we have not seen for a long time, which is the result of frustration, genuine frustration, that doesn't date back 20 years, it dates back 40 years, because the Arabs who have been in refugee camps have been there for 40 years, not because of anything to do with Israel. They've been there because the Arab states have deliberately preserved the refugee problem to use as a weapon against Israel, because the Arab states have for 40 years refused any kind of offer to make peace with Israel, to reconcile themselves to the existence of Israel, and to negotiate a settlement under which everybody can live peacefully side by side.
Of course, the Arabs are saying just the opposite, that Israel is repressing the population and is denying the Palestinians the just homeland. Is this an argument that will be going back and forth like ping pong, or is there some way, perhaps, that these disturbances, these riots, will maybe precipitate some sort of denouement?
I think there was every reason to believe before the Arab violence began that we had reached a point after 40 years when a growing number of Arab leaders, including the majority of the Palestinian Arabs, had begun to reconcile themselves to the existence of Israel in their midst and were moving in the direction of some kind of meaningful negotiation with us, to accept perhaps one of the many solutions that have been offered over the years, but anyway, the beginning of dialogue. And it is precisely the people who don't want a dialogue, who don't want a peace with Israel, who don't want Israel to exist, who have been using this genuine frustration as a dangerous instrument against Israel.
Mike, I think you used a very appropriate term when you introduced the question to the Consul General. You said Israel is being portrayed as a Goliath. And I think the word portray is a very important word, because in fact, that is what's happening. The media has chosen Israel, as it did in 1982 during the Lebanese war, as a whipping boy. And the effect of this is to portray Israel in the worst possible light.
All right, but the fact is people are getting killed here, and they're not Israelis, they're Palestinians, supposedly defenseless Palestinians who are throwing rocks and being met with bullets.
Well, they're throwing a few other things as well.
Knives, Molotov cocktails. The fact is that while I think that the American Jewish community, and no one can presume to speak for the American Jewish community, it's dangerous to do that, but I think the American Jewish community would certainly coalesce on the issue that it is concerned about the death of anyone in Israel, Arab, Jew. And this special concern is reflected in the diversity of opinion that has erupted over the issue of Israel defending itself against riots, which, from all the information that we have, were begun by those who oppose the existence of Israel as a nation state, the PLO and certain of the Arab states who have refused to even recognize Israel, let alone make peace with Israel for 40 years.
I think I would have to take issue with some of that analysis, but not all. We in the Labor Zionist Alliance see ourselves as allies of the Labor Party and see our leader as Shimon Peres, or at least the leader in Israel with whom we are most sympathetic. The divisions within the American Jewish community are different from the divisions within what we would call the non-Jewish press. The non-Jewish press is very much focused on the particular events of the day and focused on what the Israelis are doing versus what the Palestinians are doing. The American Jewish community, as I read it, and certainly we labor Zionists, are much more concerned with the precipitating events over the last 20 to 40 years. There is no doubt that the restoration of order is primary, and I would hazard a guess that while there have certainly been incidents that are outrageous, the Israeli security officer blasting away with his Uzi at fleeing Palestinians is one example, but we would hope those are exceptions. It's the events of the last 20 at least, and certainly 40 years, that are dividing opinion in the American Jewish community. While we are united on the events of 1948 through 1967 and their interpretation, and everything you have said about that is correct, we are somewhat divided on the behavior of Israel after that.
Well, let me
It
just
is
stop you for
clear-
a second.
all right.
Do you take exception to the fact that American Jews are divided on what the Israeli government is doing? Mark Tannenbaum, okay, noted American Jewish leader, says it's monumental chutzpah to think American Jewry can function as the foreign ministry of Israel. And yet there are people, American Jews, who are concerned about the way Israel is handling this.
I think I would be very disappointed if they weren't concerned, because we would like to feel that American Jews feel with us the very severe problems that we have to face. This is not to say that anyone here can propose solutions that we haven't thought of or somebody else hasn't.
But why is the media always taking the
Now,
routes?
the media and some of its readers or friends have told us in no uncertain way what we shouldn't do. Nobody has yet come up with a reasonable suggestion as to what we should do. Because you have to go back a little in history and remember not only that the problem of the Palestinian Arabs was not created by Israel, it was created by the Arab states in refusing to have an Arab state alongside Israel in 1947, in refusing to turn the armistice agreements after they tried to wipe out the state of Israel and failed, in refusing to turn the armistice agreements into peace, in refusing after 1967 to accept the offer of returning every inch of territory that we occupied in the wake of that attack on us, and instead saying no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel, which forced us to take an entirely different line in fashioning the future defense and foreign policy of the State of Israel, in turning down the Camp David Agreement of 1978, which included, besides the peace with Egypt, which has been accomplished, it's not ideal, but it's a great deal better than no peace, which envisaged, to my mind, the most far-reaching and generous plan yet devised to begin to resolve the problem of the Palestinian Arabs. We could have begun implementing that in 1979, and the military government would have ceased to exist then.
I think this is a good example of the problem. Here we sit, we are four Jews discussing among ourselves the problems that Israel is confronting, both the real problems and the media problems. Israel has no one apparently to talk to other than itself in terms of dealing with this, because there is no Arab leader who wishes to show the courage to reach back his hand to Israeli leadership, which even reluctantly, if one is to presume that the present Prime Minister is opposed to an international peace conference, at least some stories in the newspaper, and I think the facts are that Secretary Shultz finally persuaded the Prime Minister to sit down at a conference table, at an internationally convened conference table, and would bring King Hussein to that table, ultimately to discuss face-to-face the problem in the territories. And King Hussein refused participation in this kind of event.
You've been
Let's
sitting rather
move.
patiently,
Well,
Professor. Go ahead.
Because I'm mostly agreeing with what Tzvi and Rich are saying. The Palestinian Arabs and their putative leadership, the PLO, have been remarkably, legendarily remiss in responding to any opportunity. Now, the question is, do we want to use that to say we Jews are completely the victims and we and Israel have no leverage whatsoever to do anything? Or shall we rather say that we have a certain amount of power within certain perimeters, within certain parameters, there are things we can do, and what are they? And there are things we maybe should not do, and what are they? Let's address, first of all, the issue of Palestinian leadership. No Arab leader has come forth, but remember, for the first decade or so, relatively few Israelis were willing to accept the idea that there was a Palestinian nationhood or an entity that saw itself that way. That has fortunately changed. There has been, let us say, an unfortunate increase in deportations since the present minister, Yitzhak Rabin, has been in control of the territories. And those of us who read carefully the Israeli press notice that those deportations, more often than not, are deportations of figures who might have become political leaders, journalists, activists who are, how can we say?
Israelis call them, some Israelis call them terrorists.
No, some Israelis do, and what has happened is that they are deported. Hannah Signora, for example, was arrested last week for calling for a strike on Israeli products. That's a form of harassment which, while well within the rights of the state.
Don't mix him up with those who've been expelled, because they're all people
let's
with a
say
long
that there
record
are
of
many,
severe criminal activity.
Well, I think we should explore that record. That record was developed, and you can read this in the Israeli press, by the Shin Bet, which itself has admitted to perjury over the last few months, not only
I'm
to
talking
torture
of the
and
content,
perjury.
not who developed it. We're talking about people who've been arrested, sentenced, spent a long time in
I'm not talking
jail.
about the 9 deportees now.
That
I'm talking
generally
about earlier
is-
deportations.
Deportations are not resorted to, and they're resorted to under the Jordanian law, under which 2,000 Arabs were deported at the time. Nobody talks about that now.
So you and I
but we're
are not
talking
going to
about
agree
people
on
who
that.
are associated directly with the instigation of terrorist acts and the loss of life.
I think
That is the criterion.
I think that we've seen, at least historically, that when Palestinian moderates have spoken up in favor of relationships with the Israeli government, that they have suffered more at the hands of their own people, PLO or other extremist elements within the Palestinian community. They've been killed,
That's
they've
correct.
been maimed, they haven't been deported, and I question which is worse, maiming and killing or being deported.
See, this is the form of the argument that usually gets us Jews into a cul-de-sac. Obviously, maiming and killing is worse, and obviously, Sari Nusseibeh, the professor at Birzeit University, was beaten and had his arm broken by PLO nationalists and not by Jews. The question is, within the limited range in which Israel can negotiate, is the deportation of journalists prima facie evidence that they were in contact with terrorist groups?
Nobody has been deported because he was a
Tzvi,
journalist.
please. I'm going to finish one sentence here. That is the claim of the Shin Bet, which has admitted to perjury. Secondly, there are two-tiered activities in the West Bank, which could be ended, which I think exacerbate the situation. For example, there are families of suspected Palestinian terrorists who have parts or all of their homes blown up. There are convicted Jewish terrorists who wind up in rehabilitation yeshivas or who wind up with their life sentences commuted. Now, it is well within the rights of Israel as a sovereign state to do that kind of thing. That's not an issue. The question is it smart? Does it lend to a de-escalation of tensions in the territories? Or does it reinforce those elements within the Palestinian community who say the Jews want nothing but settlements, they're going to take it all over, they cannot be dealt with, they are in league with the devil?
I think that is a very so one-sided a perception that even the Palestinian Arabs don't see it that way because they know it's different. You're talking about a total of maybe between 50 and 60,000 Jews who live among 1.5 million Arabs. Many of them in places that were Jewish settlements before 1948. Jews lived in Hebron until 1929. They certainly lived by the Dead Sea and the Jordan River, and they lived in the Gaza Strip. The kibbutzim in the Gaza Strip were the first to be overrun in 1948 when the Egyptians began their march on Israel. We believe that if 700,000 Arabs can live as citizens with equal rights within Israel, there's no reason why a few thousand Israelis shouldn't live in places that have previously been occupied by, I don't want to say occupied, it's a wrong connotation, previously been developed and settled by Jews, and above all, that overlook strategic points that will prevent whatever the future settlement is, that area from again becoming a springboard for the kind of attack on Israel that was launched in 1967. But that is the purpose for which they're there, in a very limited degree.
At the same time, though, the Arabs who are living, the Palestinians who are living in the occupied territories do not have the same rights as the Arabs who are living within the borders.
Because they are citizens of Jordan. They live under temporary military occupation in accordance with international law. But international law provides them with the rights that they had under the law that was previously in force there, namely the Jordanian law. What we have done is give them a degree of social and economic services, of human rights, of recourse to law, to a degree that they never had under the Jordanians and never would have in any Arab state, which is not to say that we've solved their political aspirations.
But at the same time, is it not true that there's a lot more bureaucratic system heaped on the citizens of the occupied territories than there is on the Arab citizens of Israel proper? And these people who are living in the territories, don't they feel as though they're the target of every bureaucrat who comes into the Israeli government?
I don't think so. I think you'll find that many things are much simpler in the occupied territories because they're run by a pragmatic system and they're run by a system that knows it is not there in place for good. Whereas within Israel, a lot of people complain, I'm not talking about the Arab citizens, because they face the same bureaucracy that Jews face. And Jews in Israel complain, and many American visitors complain, that there is too much bureaucracy in Israel. It's a democracy of your kind, which also has a lot of bureaucracy.
Without wishing to agree or disagree with Svi as to whether it's a simpler life
in
wait a
minute. Now,
you have
territories. You, as in your own words, respectfully disagreed with the way the government, and I am quoting from the Washington Jewish Week from the 1st of December, where you talk about reacting with respectful disbelief to Ambassador Brosh's discussion of the way the Israel government is handling these uprisings. So obviously you don't exactly feel comfortable with all the policies either.
Well, I think we should, without getting into what the quote meant in terms of whether I
brought it up. You can,
At our JCRC meeting, Svi made a detailed presentation several weeks ago at the onset of these riots in the territories, and I was reflecting on what I saw from the Bima as being the reaction of the audience, not necessarily my own reaction. Okay. I would say since then, however, the American Jewish community has perhaps coalesced in perhaps a defensive posture for a number of reasons. I with them. One, what I believe is a media attack on Israel, the attempts to describe Israel in terms of South Africa, done by two of the major networks at least. The statements by at least one supposed presidential candidate taking a position, an anti-Israel position, and the statements made by Arafat on national television and media have all helped to coalesce a feeling, I think a much more supportive feeling on the part of American Jewry. And also we've gained a better understanding of some of the causes of the riots than we had at the onset of those riots.
The
several weeks
causes
ago.
being, as you said, Mr. Ambassador, instigated by the PLO?
I didn't say that.
That
What
was
I
a
said
question.
was,
Instigated by
what
Arab-
I said was that you have violence stirred up by people who are genuinely frustrated, and that frustration dates back 40, not 20 years, who are angry, who are uncontrolled, and whose anger is being exploited by the PLO and other terrorists in order to create a situation in which a negotiation and a peaceful settlement will be put off, if not prevented.
I don't understand quite the difference between what you said and what I said, but I'll accept what
There
you
is
said.
no question that there was a popular, spontaneous element that began the original
But it's been
demonstrations,
fed.
which were not lethal, which were not quite so bad in the early stage. What happened was that there were elements that whipped up this agitation that had already existed and turned it into a political instrument for themselves, in the course of which the lives of Israeli soldiers were at peril. And that created a vicious circle, with your media reporting only on the Israeli reaction and not on the original circle of violence that began the whole thing.
It seems so not simple, but the media is always, regardless of the issue, a very convenient way to shift blame or shift responsibility or whatever. Obviously, this is not a one-sided issue. However, when you say the media is whipping up a negative image of Israel, the change in the media's perception of Israel began generally with the Lebanon situation. And Israel stopped being seen as the David and started to be seen more as Goliath. And I look at one cartoon that sticks out in my mind is the one where you see an Israeli, I guess a Jew, presumably an Israeli, standing on top of a Palestinian with a sign that says Free Soviet Jews. Now this is pretty strong stuff.
I would only disagree. By the way, I think that I'm certainly in total agreement that this is a vicious media attack. I don't think we're simply blaming the messenger, and I'll get to it in a minute. But first of all, I think it dates from '67, not the Lebanon War. I think we can certainly trace the change in the American and certainly the European press attitudes towards Israel from 1967. And that's very telling, because there again we can move past the events of the day and see what the underpinnings are. My analysis of it is that Europe and America, as essentially Christian enclaves, have a particular perception of how Jews should be. And we have not been fulfilling their archetype or stereotype since that time, and that doesn't go down very well. That is to say, we are loved as victims. I think Mr. Shamir is absolutely right on that. And I think that the shift you have seen has little to do with the events, but has to do, first of all, with a desire, unexplored in spite of the Holocaust, to see the Jew as a victim, and an unwillingness to explore, in fact, their complicity in the Holocaust, which leads to a desire to watch us do the same thing. Otherwise, what we would read in the press is, the Israelis are now behaving exactly the way the Chinese are behaving in Tibet, or the Sri Lankans are behaving towards the Tamils. We don't read
Indians.
that. What we read is the way the South Africans are behaving towards the blacks, or as Gary Wills tells us, we've built concentration camps that are just similar to the ones that the Nazis built, except a minor detail, and the Israelis let them go rather than put them in gas chambers. This, by the way, the same Gary Wills who described Simon Wiesenthal as a vengeful man who goes beyond the law in seeking out Nazis. So I think what we have here is a dynamic in the country and in Europe, which we see focused on the media and which we can see in the biased press reports.
The media then, you're saying, Israel isn't playing out the role that the media has designed for it? And
I think the
media
Jews in
will
general are
So what's
not.
going to happen? The media is going to have to adapt, is what you're saying?
I don't frankly care what the media are going to do. In fact, I've been disciplining myself. I've been only reading the Israeli press, the New York Times, and the New Republic. And even the New York Times always puts Israel and South Africa on the same page.
But the Israeli press has been a lot more
And
critical in
that's
many
what
respects
bothers me.
than the US
Exactly.
press.
And what I've been trying to address here is what I've been reading in the Israeli press. There is no doubt that this occupation has improved the economic, social, and physical lives of the Arabs in the territories. There is also no doubt that on one side of the Green Line there are Arab citizens with rights, and on the other side there is a military administration, admittedly so, with a two-tiered, let us be gentle, a two-tiered system of justice. I gave one example, which is the dynamiting of how the Arab terrorists versus the Jewish terrorists. The second example, of course, is what was most recently admitted by the Shin Bet. There are examples after examples that you can cull from the Israeli press that suggest, as the New Republic would say, there are some smart actions and some stupid actions, and it would be better to move toward the smart
What
action.
government is not guilty of that?
Indeed, Svi, I'm not suggesting that we have enormous latitude, but this is a very auspicious time for peace.
You know, Jeff brings up an important point. I don't have the willpower he does. I read the American press also. Newsweek, on its cover this week or last, talks about Israel at war. And that's essentially and factually, as a headline, accurate. This is a continuation of a war. It is a war in the territories, and unfortunately it is a war that the elders of that community now force their children to conduct. It makes for good news, good media coverage, but it doesn't make for peace. And in all of our discussion, I still go back to the question, Jeff has suggested there are perhaps areas where Israel itself could reach out for peace. It's an intellectual exercise because there is not an Arab leader willing to respond.
In the 2 minutes we have to conclude, let's bring up your point, Richard, the whole idea that maybe a lot of this is dependent on some more charismatic leadership on both sides. Agree or disagree?
It's not just one side. Currently, as you know, there is a debate within Israel on an international peace conference. The debate, unfortunately, is hypothetical, because the International Peace Conference has been made conditional by King Hussein upon Soviet participation. At the moment, it is the Soviets who are holding up the holding of such a conference because they will not accept the kind of participation that we accept. They will not accept the kind of agenda that the United States and Israel expect. If there is to be a change in Soviet policy, I think a lot of Arab states will begin to think more realistically. I think some of the originators of this violence will begin to think a second time. We think there is a better chance, despite everything, there is a better chance this year of progress toward a negotiation than there has been for a long time. This is a setback, undoubtedly, a serious one. But we think we can overcome it, and Israel's resolve to reach a negotiated settlement, the sooner the better, is entirely shared by the whole of the current government.
I would disagree with only one thing.
We just got to go because our time is up, and I thank all of you. Professor, Mr. Wexler, Ambassador Brosh, as you can see, this is an argument that will not go away, and we hope it does not go away, and we hope it is continued to discuss. We hope you will continue to discuss it and get some insights, we hope, from this past half hour about the complicated issue that it is. For all of us, I'm Mike Leiderman. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.